Thank you very much for your time, Professor Hadiz.
No problem.
How do you define populism within the context of Indonesia and the broader Islamic world? And what are its distinguishing features compared to other forms of populism? Can you discuss relationship between Islamist populism and illiberalism and authoritarianism in Indonesia, particularly how these dynamics intersect and influence each other within the political landscape?
Okay, well, that's a lot of complicated questions. I'll try to answer them as clearly as possible. But if I forget some aspects of your question, can you please just remind me?
Sure.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, we can talk about populism in general, and then we can talk about populism in Indonesia, and we can talk about Islamic populism in particular, and then its relationship with forms of illiberalism. Okay, so first of all, I mean, the most basic definition of populism, which I don't think one can argue against, but it's highly descriptive, is that populism is a tendency that presents politics as a conflict between what is deemed to be the elites and the people or the masses, where the elite is often presented as being corrupt or rapacious or culturally aloof, and the people are considered to be basically good and virtuous. But that is a very, very basic, I think, understanding of populism. And the point that I try to make in my some of my writings is that there is a contextual element of today's populisms in the world that cannot be ignored. And the proposition that I make is that virtually all contemporary populisms in the world are, in one way or another, a response to the socio-economic and political effects of neoliberal globalization, with which different societies have intersected in different ways and with different kinds of effects within domestic social structures, right? This second proposition I make is that there is a class element in populism, which is not that often sort of focused on in the literature. And I think of populism specifically in the current context that I mentioned of neoliberal globalization as one that represents, in different contexts, different kinds of class alliances. And I would suggest that these class alliances, again, they are socially and historically produced, and they also are produced in the way that these specific histories and social structures then intersect with globalization, resulting in asymmetrical class alliances. So, for example, in some contexts, you can have, populism as representing the interest of sections of a big bourgeoisie, sections of a middle class, and sections of, let's say, the working class, or even the peasantry. And it's asymmetrical because the driving force in these populist alliances may be, a particular class or a relationship between particular classes in which, the power or influence is not equitable. So I find that, for example, in Indonesian populism, that there is an alliance, between those classes that I mentioned, but where actually the key social agents come from the middle class and the lower middle class, and these are really people who have aspirations of going up the sort of social ladder and are sort of obstructed by the structures of that have intersected with neoliberal globalization, which have resulted in social inequalities all over the world, in all the major economies of the world, but in an alliance. Often it is with, as in America, you find, like sections of, sort of big business actually funding populist movements, right? And it's actually, and the social agents are really the lower middle class whose aspirations are not met, in the process of social and economic development, left behind, and the lower classes as well, whose aspirations are also similarly blocked, but maybe less organized, and have less, sort of, access to socio-economic and political vehicles than, let's say, educated middle classes. So going back to Indonesia, and maybe just to veer, directly to the concept of Islamic populism. Now, I suggest that Islamic populism is a very specific kind of populism, whereby the idea of the people that I mentioned before is actually replaced by the idea of the ummah. So the community of believers, which, in spite of globalization, right, becomes more nationally defined than ever before, because the struggles of that ummah is nationally defined within national borders, and and its social agents, usually in Indonesia, usually representing lower middle classes whose social mobility have been obstructed, in spite of education, in spite of upskilling and all that, who have sort of voiced their grievances in the language of social justice, which they can find within Islamic cultural resources.
All right.
And not from liberal or not from leftists or whatever, sort of cultural resources. Now, the problem with Indonesian Islamic populism, as opposed to Turkish Islamic populism, is that Indonesian Islamic populism is very much a middle class phenomenon, because of the inability of that middle class to actually forge an alliance upward to sections of the big bourgeoisie. In Turkey, that has taken place through what you understand, or what you call the Anatolian bourgeoisie, the big businesses that have come out of the provinces, who want to challenge, the old Kemalist businesses, the traditional ascendancy of the Kemalist businesses, and that alliance then provides them with the resources to bring the poor, including the urban poor, into this cross-class alliance, because then there are the organizational capacity, coming from the middle class, and the financial resources to actually provide things like social welfare, sort of initiatives and so on, which will bring in the poor. Whereas in Indonesia, because the big bourgeoisie tends to be ethnically Chinese and therefore not a member of the Umat, that sort of thing can't happen, and therefore only occurs in a much more limited fashion than, let's say, in Turkey, and therefore the ability of those social agents of Islamic populism in Indonesia, which tends to be concentrated in the urban lower middle class, to bring lower classes up in alliances through social welfare initiatives, educational initiatives and so on, can't take place, right? So a few things there. All are responses to social inequality, social contradictions coming out of neoliberal globalization, or populisms they are manifested and they are expressed differently because of socio-historical differences, and also because of available cultural resources. So, for example, in Muslim majority countries, especially where the left is absent or very much weak, Islam can provide the sort of language of politics that to which ideas about social justice, however framed, can be latched onto, right? Whereas in Brazil or some other society, well, Islam can't provide that language, right? They will try to go to other kinds of cultural resources to frame a language that can result in the sort of cross-class alliance that I mentioned before. That's a very long answer, wasn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, indeed. We have many more questions, Professor. So each question, if you can take 2-3 minutes, I
Okay,
think
sorry about that. That was
fine.
too long.
But thank you. The next question is, what are the key characteristics of Islamist populist movements in Indonesia since the 60s, and how they interacted with democracy in post-Suharto period? Can you provide a historical perspective of relationship between populism and Islamism in Indonesia, and explain their impact on governance, societal dynamics, identity politics?
So I also differentiate between what I called older forms of Islamic populism and newer forms of Islamic populism. So older forms of Islamic populism tend to be concentrated in the petty bourgeoisie, the old class of traders, small landowners and so on, right? Whereas modern Islamic populism tends to be focused on the urban lower middle class and the educated middle class, and whose aspirations have been blocked, even though they've been given all of these promises, the promises, in spite of the promises of modernity that they've been exposed to. Okay, so the difference between the 60s and now is that Islamic populism in Indonesia is no longer based on these old, traders and landowners, small landowners, and so on, but is, sort of more dominated by a newer segment of society produced by the modernization process, and that is the urban middle class, lower middle class. Okay, and therefore the contents of their aspirations will be different as well. So in the old forms of Islamic populism, usually there is a suspicion of capitalism. Okay, whereas because capitalism tended to be represented by the dominance of foreign capital through colonialism and imperialism. Whereas in the newer forms of Islamic populism, it can go either way. Yeah, it can be an element of real, strongly sort of belligerent anti-foreign sort of sentiments. In Indonesia, anti-ethnic Chinese sentiments, because ethnic Chinese control big business, but also an idea that capitalism can provide an avenue for upward social mobility, and therefore compromises can be made with capitalism. And in Indonesia, they look especially at actually the case of Turkey,
Right.
where that happened, that capitalism provided an avenue for upward mobility and access to state power, to these social agents that had been peripheralized under Kemalism. Now, in Indonesia, that has not transpired, or at least only to a very, very limited extent. Yeah. So that's the difference between old and new Islamic populism. And in Indonesia, the relationship between this new populism, Islamic populism, and democracy is also a bit complex. On the one hand, there are social agents who say that Islam isn't democracy isn't compatible with Islam, because of the idea of a caliphate and so on. But others who see that together with inroads within the market, democracy provides an avenue for upward social mobility and access over state power. So then you do have Islamic populists who form political parties and try to compete within the democratic arena, and are not, completely anti-democratic, and in fact are sympathetic to the mechanisms of democracy, because they see that in some places, it has provided an avenue for upward social mobility and control over some aspects of the state.
All right. How do you assess how, how do you assess the role of populist rhetoric and strategies in the recent Indonesian elections, particularly regarding Prabowo Subianto's victory? What factors contributed to his success, and how significant was the influence of populism in shaping voter preferences?
Well, this is, an interesting case, because, in 2014 and 2019, the previous elections, there was this great mobilization of populist sentiment of the nationalists as well of the Islamist, variety. Whereas in the current, in the 2024 election, the rhetoric was kind of contained, and partly because in this instance, Prabowo had abandoned his old allies within the Islamic populist community in favor of the statist nationalists that have control over the state bureaucracy. Why? Because they, not the Islamic populists, could provide him with the material resources to buy the vote of the poor. So you saw a great, sort of concerted effort to sort of disseminate, social aid, food and rice and so on to the poor. And this came out of the state and the apparatus of the state machinery, but working, to give the idea that this fellow here, Prabowo, was for the, and in this case, a populist, but a nationalist populist, right? And we see that the candidate who hit one of his opponents, Anies Baswedan, who used to be an ally of his actually, and is linked more closely to the Islamists, was not able to actually activate, an Islamic populist kind of challenge to this state bureaucratic run effort to sort of mobilize support, because that activation actually required alliances with particular social agents of the state, including the military and including local government and so on, which in this case were mobilized for Prabowo. So we see that again here that the power of Islamic populism in Indonesia is much more limited than it is in Turkey, for example, right? Because of the upward and downward connections being weaker. Which means that in order to be activated and to be effective, it needs alliances actually with particular social agents of the state, which in this case had been, sort of pushed in the direction away from them and towards a kind of more nationalist, status-oriented form of populism to be exploited by the winning candidate, General Prabowo.
Okay. What implications does Prabowo Subianto's recent electoral victory have for democracy in Indonesia? Are there concerns regarding the consolidation of populist leadership and its impact on democratic institutions and processes?
Well, first of all, Indonesia is often put forward as a successful case of, democratic transformation, and in many ways that reputation is well deserved. However, a lot of people who laud Indonesia forget that it is a democracy that has always been corrupt, highly flawed, in terms of rights. That its rights are the rights of minorities and vulnerable peoples and so on have always been sort of limited, and also that it remains controlled by what I've called an oligarchy. The oligarchy being an alliance between the upper echelons of the state bureaucracy and the upper echelons of the bourgeoisie. This alliance had been actually established in the old authoritarian era under Suharto. But with democratization after 1998, this oligarchy actually survived, right? And then they took over Indonesia's institutions of democracy and of governance. So they now dominate, virtually all the major political parties. They dominate the institutions of state, mass organizations, and so on. So Indonesian democracy has always been an oligarchically dominated democracy, right? Now, the problem with Prabowo being elected is that he is from the heart of the oligarchy. He is the son-in-law of Suharto, the old dictator, and he is a person who represents all of the old bad habits of the oligarchy that democracy was supposed to paper over. That includes infringement of human rights. That includes being, his family being involved in questionable economic activities, debts to the state that because of bill connections remain sort of outstanding, and the fact that he has really been on the record as having very little regard for democratic processes, let alone human rights, right? So whilst Indonesian democracy has always been sort of compromised by its oligarchic character, the election of Prabowo adds a new dimension of danger to it.
I'm going to come to that, Professor.
Okay, yeah.
The New York Times ran a story right after the elections claiming that Subianto's victory has cast doubts on the future of one of the world's most vibrant democracies. The era of liberty that followed the ousting of Suharto, critics say, could now be under threat with Prabowo's ascent to power. Let me ask you bluntly, is the biggest Muslim democracy and the third largest democracy in the world in danger?
Well, the fact of the matter is that a lot of these rights have been turned back over many years. Yeah. So over the last 10 years and more, I would say that a lot of these rights have been turned back anyway. So what Prabowo's ascension will mean, I think, is that the continuing, sort of pushing back of those rights and the acceleration of that pushing back, and therefore the diminishing of Indonesian democracy to the point where I think it is reasonable for people who are supportive of democracy in Indonesia to be concerned about whether there will be any substantive democracy left in Indonesia apart from having elections.
All right. With Subianto in power with nationalist populism and Islamism, are we going to witness a replay of Narendra Modi in India or Donald Trump in the US, meaning the era of liberal democracy has ended?
Well, first of all, liberal democracy never had a field day in Indonesia because there have never been any strong liberal democratic or social democratic parties in Indonesia. In Indonesia, all the major parties are either nationalist status or Islamic nationalists. Okay, so first of all, let's not over romanticize the recent past. Indonesia was never a liberalized democracy. Yeah. Will it put an end to it? Well, what it does is that rather than put an end to it, it will, I think, kill off, the sources of impulse that had existed within Indonesian society to mitigate against the illiberalism of the oligarchy and to struggle for a broadening of rights, across across Indonesian society, in spite of that oligarchic dominance, and therefore it will signify really ultimately that the oligarchy has attained almost full control of Indonesian democracy, and that challenges to them, which would involve, the securing and the broadening of rights, more social equality, and a broadening of access to power and economic resources and so on, will be staved off.
All right. In your article, No Turkish Delight, the impasse of Islamic party politics in Indonesia, you compare the cases of AKP and PKS. What results does this comparison between AKP and PKS yield in terms of populisms the respective parties employed?
It's very clear. In Turkish elections, the AKP, even though it supports, can vacillate, comes out as the victor, right? The PKS always loses. And the presidential candidate that it supports lost, right? So this is another sort of representation of what I said to you earlier, that Islamic populism, whilst it has developed in Indonesia, is something that has not developed to the extent that it has in Turkey, and therefore, it requires all of these kinds of alliances and compromises and so on, And in spite of that, it remains, outside of the core of power. Now, I'm not saying that because of that, it doesn't exert any influence. No, I'm not saying that at all. But what happens really is that forces that don't come out of sort of the Islamic kind of networks and backgrounds and so on preempt these Islamic forces by adopting some of their rhetoric. So, for example, we have a recently passed criminal law code that incorporates a lot of the moralistic, sort of concerns having to do with sexual relations and these sorts of things that the Islamists talk about. What does this do? Well, it preempts them, right? Because that they can't use it to attack, those who really dominate the state. But at the same time, we see, right, even though they're not in power, the mainstreaming of the kind of moralistic, understanding of social relationships and politics that they advocate. So even without winning, even though they lose all the time, right, there is a mainstreaming of their ideas, which contributes, furthermore, to the illiberalism of Indonesian democracy, because a lot of these ideas, tend towards the illiberal side.
All right. And lastly, Professor, how does the phenomenon of Islamist populism in Indonesia compare and contrast with similar movements in other Muslim majority countries? What are the similarities and differences, especially between Islamist populism in Indonesia and the MENA region?
Well, I'd say that, first of all of these have a long history that you can trace at least to the early 20th century, right? But in the past, it used to be sort of dominated by sort of older forms of populism, and now it's more modern, and that's the case in MENA as well. If you go to Egypt, right? I mean, the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, now defunct, it used to be doctors, engineers, lawyers, and so on. These were the key social agents of the Muslim Brotherhood. You go to Turkey, right? You also have these sorts of characters, not these, not the old provincial guys that you might have seen in the 50s, right? So the social transformations brought about by capitalist development, by globalization, have impacted in a similar way across MENA, right? But of course, the specific histories and the way that these countries sort of intersect with neoliberal globalization, have been different, right? And therefore, you have different specific manifestations. Now, in Indonesia, the difference is that, okay, this is the way I like to point it to point it out. In Turkey, right, Islamic populism has dominated the state and a large extent of civil society. In Egypt, Islamic populism, until recently, dominated civil society, but failed to dominate the state. In Indonesia, Islamic populism has up to now failed to dominate the state as well as civil society.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that.
Okay, I hope I was clear. I mean, I do tend to talk a lot.
It was very clear, very concise, very to the point. Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
All the
Bye.
best. Bye-bye.